good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating today's special Read for Pixels panel session, which is also the 5th YouTube session of the 7th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Now, through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project collaborates with award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll tell you a little bit more about the fundraiser later on, but if you want to find out more about violence against women and how to stop it, you can go to our website at www.thepixelproject.net. Now, today's YouTube session is a very special one because it is our 5th Read for Pixels author panel session. Now, multi-author panel sessions are a recent addition to the Read for Pixels program. We created these sessions to be an accessible resource to writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. And today's panel session topic is writing about violence against women in romance in the age of Me Too. Now, here to take part in the discussion are 3 award-winning best-selling romance authors. The first, right below me, is Adriana Herrera, and Adriana was born and raised in the Caribbean and loves writing stories about people who look and sound like her people, getting unapologetic happy endings. Her Dreamer series has received star reviews from publications including Publishers Weekly and Booklist, and has been featured in the Today Show on NBC, Entertainment Weekly, Oprah Magazine, NPR, Library Journal, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. She is also a trauma therapist in New York City, working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Next is Bec McMaster, who is next to Adriana. Bec is the award-winning author of the London steampunk romance series and paranormal romance series The Dark Arts and The Burned Lands. She has been nominated for RT Review's Best Steampunk Romance for Heart of Iron. She has won RT Review's Best Steampunk Romance with Of Silk and Steam, and Forged by Desire was nominated for Rita Award in 2015. The series has received star reviews from Booklist, Publishers Weekly, and Library Journal, with Heart of Iron named one of the best romances of 2013. And last but not least is Jeannie Lin. And Jeannie Lin is next to me. She is a USA Today bestselling author whose stories are inspired by a mix of historical research and wuxia adventure tales. Jeannie's groundbreaking historical romances are set in Tang Dynasty China, and they have received multiple awards, including the Golden Heart for her debut novel, Butterfly Swords. Jeannie also writes an Opium War steampunk series called the Gunpowder Chronicles, and her historical erotica series, Princess Shanyin, is written under the name Liliana Lee. Now, you, the audience, will be able to ask the panel questions today, but just make sure that you're logged on into your YouTube account so that you can access the chat box next to the screen. And today's producer, Anusha, will relay them to me to read out to Adriana, Bec, and Jeannie to answer. So we're talking about writing romance today, so please try to make sure that your questions are geared towards it, but we won't mind a fan question or 2 either. Now, before we begin, we thought you'd like to know that all 3 panelists have also donated some awesome treats to the stash of author goodies we have up on our Read for Pixels fundraising page on Rally Up. And Adriana has 2 goodies available. She has a signed and personalized bundle of 6 of her books, including your Dreamer series, and a written critique of 5,000 words for a romance work in progress, followed by a 30-minute Skype discussion. And Bec has 3 goodies available. Her signed and personalized bundle of her London Steampunk series has already been stepped up by a generous donor named Jasmine Hunt. Thank you so much, Jasmine. She also is offering a written critique of up to 10,000 words of a romance work in progress for any donor who wishes to have more one-to-one coaching after this panel. And well, in writing anyway. And she's also offering for 1 week only between 11th March to 18th of March, the opportunity for donors to donate just $10 to us in order to download the first chapters of her eagerly awaited Curse of Darkness novel. And Jeannie has 2 goodies available. Now, her romance reader gift bundle has already been snapped up. Thank you so much to Megan Real for donating $100 to us to get the bundle. And Jeannie also has a bundle for budding romance author featuring a written critique session and an autographed print copy of Finding Your Writer's Voice by Jeannie and her writing partner for this book, Bria Quinlan. And we have raised $760 so far in our quest to reach a $5,000 goal. That means we're moving a little slower than usual. So please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women, including panel sessions like this. Now onwards. Now, just to give you all a bit of background, the romance genre is the biggest selling genre today, with many of its biggest names reaching the top of the bestseller list, including the New York Times and USA Today lists. In the last 5 years, it has even reached a breakthrough on screen with shows like Bridgerton and Virgin River, drawing huge numbers of viewers and demonstrating the appeal of a good feminist love story. Yet, despite the genre's massive mainstream appeal and considerable progress it has made in the last 30 years in addressing issues like consent, sexism, misogyny, and violence against women, romance continues to be criticized for being anti-feminist, of providing unrealistic portrayals of sexual and romantic relationships, and of glorifying toxic relationships. So with that in mind, let's get the discussion started. So first and foremost, how can a romance author tell if violence against women belongs in their story, or if their story can be told more effectively using other story catalysts and plot devices? And we'll begin with Adriana.
Well, I think when I read that question, like the first thing that comes to mind is like, in a romance, I don't know if there's a need for like graphic violence against women to be depicted in the story. I don't know, like I think about, like, because I am a trauma therapist and I work with a lot of survivors who have experienced interpersonal violence, specifically, in a romantic relationship. Like, to me, like, there's stages in a recovery of domestic violence. And when I think about that, and I think how it would serve a story that's a romance, where you have somebody that is going to, from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, find a happy ending and healing, to realistically like show the healing process. I don't know how you could fit in someone who is like actively experiencing violence in the story. And so that's why to me, it's like, it's kind of like one thing doesn't really work with the other, at least how I see how a romance should play out. Mm-hmm. And I personally don't think it really like graphic violence against women in a story, to me, just isn't necessary ever, frankly.
Okay, Bec?
So for me, I write fantasy romance, which is sort of, there's probably a lot of violence in my stories because of obviously plot-based things. But for me, it's not really gendered violence. And if there are elements of that within a heroine, for example's backstory, it is often pre the book, because they're on the stage of recovery, not so much like focusing on it within the story. So and for me, as I said, there is some violence within the story, but it's often more non-gendered. For me, it's often not graphic in the terms of what is actually happening. It's more the emotional responses to it, because I don't think it needs to be like visually on that page. It's more for me about the actual emotional experience of those characters sort of within that. And as again, the violence, it's often male, like against males, against females. It's not specifically very against females in that respect.
All right, Jeannie.
Well, first, my stories. I guess one of my major series is about women or courtesans in the pleasure quarter of the Tang Dynasty. So it's almost to say, even though you don't see graphic violence, they're in the sex trade, and many of them not willingly, right? So there's just their position as an act, of violence or whatnot, of against their will. But I do want to say, although in my books, I don't think I've depicted very graphic violence, I think there is a place for graphic violence in romance. I know part of some of the things I was thinking of is other books that have depicted the violence and the healing and have done it well. And I think those authors are very skilled in the way they do it. So as the question of does it belong? I think you have to take the responsibility that to depict something like that's that potentially damaging, you really have to own it, and you have to do the work and be willing to do the work. And also it's a big risk, right? So it's a big risk to take. And I think no romance author should go into that not realizing that it's a risk and not taking some responsibility for it. I wanted to address just something you brought up originally, Regina, how romance gets denigrated for being like, poorly depicting women or being sexist and things like that. And obviously, I think that's an unfair characterization. But one of the reasons I think it's so unfair is because we as authors, as romance authors, continually discuss among each other, not just socially, not just, as women, or even men within the genre discuss it as well. We discuss it as social issues, but we also discuss it in terms of craft. So I think in order to tell whether or not it belongs in your story, I think the romance genre uniquely, because of how connected it is and how much of a community we have with each other, I think that's a big part of it is kind of discussing and getting the beta readers and getting sensitivity readers and really not making the decision just within yourself to say whether or not this belongs, getting experts like Adriana to comment. Things like that. We have that within our community, and I think that's an important part if you're going to really touch on a sensitive, subject like that.
Yeah, and there are still, like you said, there are authors who do include graphic violence against women, romance authors who include graphic violence against women in their stories. And I noticed this and I am full confession here to everybody. I am a huge romance reader, have been since I was a teenager. That's why it's such an honor to be speaking with all three of you today. And I've noticed that a lot of authors who write romantic suspense novels do include heroines who have experienced gender-based violence in the past or who actually experience male violence in the course of the story. So, okay, let's put it theoretically, if a romance author decides that they are going to incorporate some form of violence against women in their stories. So we've talked a little bit about this before. What are the particular pitfalls that they need to bear in mind? Let's start with Bec.
For me, if you're going to depict violence against women on screen, I think for me it's really important that it's not doing it for the purposes of being the male character's backstory or for them, it's not doing it to drive their story. If it's going to be on the screen for me, it's always about the female point of view and what she's experienced and what she has overcome and like how she's going about that. It's not just to be used, for him to be the protector, to be able to save the day, to come in, that kind of thing. Like, so, I personally love stories where the females are like saving their own day kind of thing and coming in with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Jeannie?
I think the flip side of that one is using it for the shock value, like to make the villain more villainous because he's a rapist, and or make the the villain more demented because he's got some sexual perversion. I think that it's very easy to kind of automatically throw in violence and throw in sexual violence for that purpose, and that's a shortcut that I think we don't want to see anymore.
Yeah, Adriana.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I did want to say when you referred to romantic suspense, I think there's a real difference in terms of like a story, when like a subgenre like romantic suspense, where like the arc of story is not connected to the person's trauma or to like the person's like traumatic experience in a relationship. And like in romantic suspense, like those like traumatic things are like incidental to the story and not central to the story. And I think that makes a big difference in terms of how you depict the violence that the person experiences and their traumatic history. I think there's also something really important to think about is what trauma history you're giving that person before did they experience domestic violence as an adult? Is there severe trauma in their childhood, and how that's going to play into like how they're experiencing trauma reactions and how they're living, like remembering trauma is not remembering, it's reliving. So when a person is reliving they're remembering what happened to them, they're reliving it like physiologically. So you have to really think about like if the person's having sex again with a partner and they experience a rape or a sexual assault, like has that person had the time to be able to receive that intimacy in a way that's not like they're reenacting their trauma? So I think those are the things that you have to really like consider when you are like saddling your character with a severe trauma history. So I did want to say that, and that's part, I think it's also part of like the pitfalls. Like what are you going to put on your character that is then like that you're not going to be able to resolve for them realistically through a story. Like if you're having someone, let's say for example, who is someone who was abandoned as a child, ended up in the foster system, was sexually abused as a child, and then is in, the army, goes to the war, comes back with PTSD from fighting in a war. That person is going to have a complex trauma history that is going to make it very difficult for them to like be connected enough to their own emotions and their body to engage realistically in a romance. So I think those are the things that we have to consider. Like it's great to give someone like a compelling backstory, but a compelling backstory where you're giving someone a trauma history they can't realistically heal from within the time frame of a book, and you don't give them the tools to do so, like you're going to be short selling your character, and also those trauma survivors that are reading that story, it's not going to reflect their experience.
Yeah, and so so that actually neatly goes into the next question, which is what are some of the techniques that romance authors can use to avoid toxic tropes that are rife with sexism, misogyny, and or violence against women, or turn those tropes on their head? Jeannie?
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about, especially because I write historical romance, and this is a pitfall that I've fallen into, and one that people may not realize, is just the pitfall of valuing a woman or valuing the heroine, the character, because of her sexuality. So it's the virginity value, right? This is a very old school romance sort of value where it's like, oh, her virginity is her value, and it's something that even as a society we still do. Kind of a big moment for me. I was following these old school tropes. My first couple of books had virgin heroines, and that in itself may not be a bad thing, but it's just the idea that do they no longer have value if they're no longer virgins, right? I think that's a very toxic stereotype or a very toxic trope that exists in historical romance. That's not to say, understandably, society, if you're writing about a society where like, oh, you need to be a virgin to be married, you can observe those things, but realize that you're not imposing that value as an author on that person's character. I believe, was it Elizabeth Smart? There was the case where there was, she's now an advocate for people who have been involved in sex trafficking and things like that. And she was kidnapped. I believe her name was Elizabeth Smart. I may be getting her name wrong.
Yeah.
And something that really, I was reading an article that she wrote, and something that really struck me was she was saying how a lot of the work that she does is just building up women's confidence, right? Because she felt that, oh, now that I'm no longer a virgin, now that I've been violated, I'm not worthy anymore. I'm not worthy of anyone's care, right? Because this has been taken away from me. And so because she was no longer a virgin, because she had lost it and she felt guilty for losing it, even though it wasn't her fault, she didn't fight. She didn't call for help. There was a case where she could have gone for help, but she didn't, because she was like, who would want to help me? And so that really changed my mind about, like, okay, it's time to turn this virgin trope around and not feel that that's what your characters have to preserve in order for them to be valued as people.
Yeah. Bec?
So for me, look, I think I'm having a moment here. Hang on a minute. For me, like writing the London Steampunk series, it was basically about writing about a historical sort of world, which is basically the upper ruling class, full of misogynistic and sort of sexist tendencies. But the underlying story was always about being able to overthrow that element. So twisting sort of the power of those that are in power. So I think threading it through was just part of twisting that trope sort of for me. And it turns out in the end that basically the women were the ones that overthrew that system. So coming into their power there. And yeah, I'm not sure that I have a lot else to add on that one.
Adriana?
Well, I mean, I think like when I write queer romance, I write and not, and I write in contemporary. I'm starting to write in historical. I'm actually writing a historical right now, and as I'm writing this historical, so it's set in 1889, it's in Paris. The heroine is from the Dominican Republic, and she's biracial. Her father's Scottish, her mother's Dominican. She's in Paris, and she meets like a Scottish earl, as you do. And I really have to negotiate, right? Like that I mean, as even in contemporary, like we are in a white supremacy, we are living in a patriarchy. So like that's the landscape that we are in, right? So like I have to go into the story like very clearly, like my heroine very clearly needs to understand her positionality, and that hero needs to understand his positionality. I can't have a man who doesn't understand the systems of oppression, a white man that doesn't, with a lot of privilege and power, that doesn't understand his privilege and the systems of oppression at work and his complicity in them, who can realistically be a hero to a Black woman in that time. Like he can't learn that along the way. He has to come in knowing that. And even if he doesn't know how to grapple with it, even though he might not know how to operationalize like his understanding of his position in that white supremacy, he has to have his consciousness, like the consciousness has to exist. And I think that to me is like the really tricky thing of writing men who are like in positions of power and that we want to sell as viable heroes. Like a man that has no consciousness around his privilege and a white supremacy and a patriarchy at the beginning of that book, like there's a lot of work to do to get him to an ending where he can be a viable hero for a woman who understands her own position and value. And so like that to me is how I enter the story, and that's like how I build their arc. And I mean, there's other things that you have to think about, like power dynamics, like how you are positioning them both. Like, is there consent in a relationship really where like one person has all the power and the other person's only power is to say yes or no to him having her body? Like, is there really consent in that? Or is that just us using the word yes as consent, where like every power dynamic around them is indicating that she can't not say no. So when she says yes, when she says no is yes, and when she says yes, it could be no, but like she doesn't have the power the agency to say no. And so those are the things that I think about, because I write Black women. And I do write relationships where there's the hero is a white man, not all the time, but I have to think about that a lot.
Okay, so you actually what you brought up actually put me in mind of, you know, in the course of the Pixel Project's work, where we hear so many stories about women being put in positions where they're being asked out for a date. They're, you know, they're 17-year-old girls being asked to prom, and they feel like they can't say no because all those stories are, you know, saying no and then being stalked or being even killed for saying no. So you're absolutely right there about the power dynamics, and that sort of pitfall is something that should be talked about, should be made more clear in certain romance books. We have questions from the audience, so we'll do a bunch of questions from the audience right now. So, okay, hello, Geetha here. I'm curious to know if the authors think there is a difference if the violence against women scenes were written by men in novels. So, let's start with Jeannie.
Yes, I think there is a marked difference. And I think the biggest difference is, and even if it's written by men, but it's the female character, I think the treatment is still different. I think the thing, and especially in romance, is when there's violence against women, it's about that woman's journey and how is she, you know, the trauma was inflicted upon her, but does she still have agency, right? How is she grappling with it? You know, even though outwardly she may not have the physical strength to do things, you kind of have that ability to get into her mind and find where is she, even if she has to retreat. What is she retreating to? What is she looking to as the source of how she's going to keep herself together? And that's really, I think, that the difference I see. Whereas, you know, when men, and not saying that they're not trying to, you know, a male author isn't trying to be sensitive when they do this, but it doesn't seem that men necessarily go into that little core of agency as much, you know, for better or worse, you know. So I think that's the main difference I see.
Okay, Bec.
Yeah, look, some do it well. Some, it's sort of hard to say, don't. But I think, again, playing off what Jeannie's sort of saying there is there's that emotional resonance that I think that we as women can understand, like on behalf of like our female characters, where sometimes it's difficult, I think, to get into that mindset of how a female would react in that situation, and also like, you know, her journey to power within that sort of is really important, I think, so in terms of as a female writer. So sometimes I think you can miss that boat. So yeah, and just the gratuitousness sometimes, I sometimes see that come into play. Yeah. Okay.
Adriana?
I mean, yes, just to kind of echo what Jeannie and Bec said, it's, I mean, like, again, for me, it's like my container is we're in a white supremacy, we are in a patriarchy. So to me, it's like it's a very like treacherous, like it's a bumpy road for, you know, technically, like historically, the oppression of women and the place of men in our society and what that violence on the page is serving. It's to further the hero story? Is it to make a point about his heroism? Like, what is that violence towards that woman serving in the story? And if it's serving as something to like further his story, then there's definitely a difference there than there's being like illusion or the existence of violence against a woman in a story where the story is like the center of the story is her healing and her recovery and her like triumphing, like triumph over that violence. There's a difference. And the lens, right? The gaze of who's writing it.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a second question from the audience, and I want to apologize to Adriana and Bec in advance because when I put it on screen, y'all might be covered up even more because that's an even longer question. Okay. Oh dear. Sorry about that. So the question is from Misty306, do you believe trigger warnings help with the content within certain romance or any stories like the Omegaverse, or are those stories more likely to be removed from retail sites such as Amazon? Let's go with Adriana first.
I mean, I don't have, I couldn't say. I know that like in my books, I put trigger warnings, but again, like I don't have graphic violence in my stories or any kind of violence that I have to like, I mean, I don't have like a lot of violence just because the stories I write don't have them. So I don't know if having like, I don't know, like a rape on the page or something like that's something that I haven't written, I haven't had to have a content warning like that would impact Amazon flagging it or something. So I don't have that experience.
Okay, Jeannie?
I don't know what a megaverse is, so if there's a clarification, I'd like to find out. But yeah, I put trigger warnings when I feel there might be, content that could be triggering because I don't need them as a reader, but other readers have said they like them, so that's why I put them. I do have an erotica series that I do put trigger warnings on. It is possible that it will get removed. It hasn't been removed from Amazon, but it does get flagged for things like I don't advertise it or anything like that. But I think it's important to be there, so the readers can know, especially because I have a range of heat levels and a range of content in what I write. My erotica series is specifically under a not so secret pen name, but the pen name is there so my readers realize it's a different persona and different content. And there is, there is dubious consent, scenarios where the heroine doesn't have control and things like that. And I do warn about that. So readers can beware if they want to avoid that.
Okay, Bec?
For me personally, I think I always like to supply content warnings sort of for my readers because I think it's a sign of respect for your readers, like, coming into it. I know, like, for me, I have certain trigger warnings myself, or triggers myself, and like, there's been times in the past where I've gone through some very traumatic events within my family, and you would read into books and it would be there, and it was just really confronting. So I think for me, it's, as I said, a really sign of respect for my reader, and it's never more important for me to get a sale, for example, from someone than for me to say, hey, this book may not be for you. I always like to forewarn in that case, and look, I often mention it in my newsletters. Like some of my books have featured miscarriage, for example, cutting, sort of things like that I think can be a traumatic reemergence of events for people. So it's really important for me to supply that, and they can choose to do what they wish to do with that knowledge. So it's just, I don't know if it takes. I don't know the best way to do that. Like for me, it's usually within the first pages of my book, and that I do sometimes put it within the blurb. I don't know that I've ever had any issues from Amazon in regards to sort of doing that, and it's not in all of my books, but just for those that may be triggering for certain people, it's they're
and what both Jeannie and Bec just said actually demonstrates how far ahead romance is in terms of issues like this when it comes to when we compare genres, because you don't get a lot of that in fantasy. You don't get a lot of that in science fiction. You don't get a lot of that certainly not in horror, but in horror everyone expects something horrible to happen, so I guess. But it is, trigger warnings are important. We do that as well for our one-to-one sessions, where before author reads a piece, if there is any violence in it or strong language. So let's move on to talking about writing female characters in romance. So the romance genre has its share of female stereotypes and tropes, including the damsel in distress or a dominant personality that needs a man to control her, a la Taming of the Shrew. So let's talk about stereotypes and writing better female characters. So can you share some tips and suggestions for portraying female characters in romance novels who have experienced rape or domestic violence or any other form of gender-based violence without reducing them to the sum of their trauma? Adriana?
Well, again, I think it's just being respectful of that character's experience, and just if you are going to give a person a trauma history where they've experienced severe violence, and and one thing I did want to say about domestic violence specifically, domestic violence is a different type of interpersonal violence than, for example, a sexual assault. There's an element to domestic violence which is like it's long term, and it's like captivity. There's a book called Trauma and Recovery by a psychiatrist and medical named Judith Herman. It's called Trauma and Recovery, from Domestic Violence to Political Terror. And it's like a seminal text in like the trauma field specific to interpersonal violence. And she talks about that the only other types of trauma that present in the same way that domestic violence presents are people who have been political prisoners or people who have being in a cult are the only two other types of traumatic experience that have similar symptoms and that manifest in the way that domestic violence does. So to say is that when a person's in a relationship like that, like the amount of like coercion and like long-term like whittling away of their sense of self is so severe and so prolonged that it really has a very long-term impact on like how they perceive themselves, how they perceive the world. And so that's not like a switch that you like turn off. Like you leave the relationship and like you're better because you're like safe. Like there's levels to it. You have to feel them. You have physical safety is number one, but after that, emotional safety can take a lot longer time. And so my advice is, if you are giving someone a severe, brutal history, then do your research. There's a lot out there. I'm happy to give some references if you need them, and like really understand how trauma manifests in people who have experienced like prolonged domestic violence, because trauma, there's this, trauma is like trauma reminders and trauma reactions, like things that you wouldn't think will remind you of the trauma you experienced, and even if you don't consciously know it, your body's remembering and you're having reactions, and that's something that doesn't go away there's like no hacks from recovering from trauma. You have to process it. And so that's like my advice, to just do the research so that you don't do something that's unrealistic and really doesn't honor the experience of a person that's in recovery or healing from their trauma.
Okay, Jeannie?
So this is actually going to be I definitely do your research. I think you need to study trauma and the nature of trauma because it's so complex. But I think this is a good kind of writing tip for that, is use other characters, right? I think one of the strengths of romance is it's the journey of the couple, but it's also full of secondary characters, and it's not a waste of page space because this is what we're here for, right? All the interpersonal relationships, not just to the hero, but to other characters as well. And I think a tip is, and I think this kind of reflects real life, right? The character who can kind of show another way, right? So one, it shows that character who has experienced trauma can connect to somebody else, and it kind of allows you to show other angles, right? And it's as simple as the person who says, I've had that happen to me, so your heroine or your protagonist can say, okay, it's not just me, can come out of isolation. And so I think that extra foil and other angle of approaching the trauma is a good way to show that, if your character is realistically in it, unable to see another way out, that's I think a good tip.
Bec?
Yeah, 100% can agree with the other Jeannie and Adriana about like doing your research and like, getting like beta readers and sensitivity readers to go through your books when you're like, you know, touching on those subjects, like just to make sure that you have portrayed it in a really thoughtful manner and not just using it as a, you know, as a plot device or something like that. I think too, for me with those characters too, it's not so much focusing fully on like, you know, not using that trauma as the soul in some of their character. Like, you know, they are people beyond that trauma as well. Like they've got so much more to them. So like not just, I don't know if I'm putting this very articulately, but you know, just to force them into like the sum and whole of that trauma is sort of, you know, there's more to them, and like there are going to be aspects through their journey like that are not just going to be simple, like, you know, moving forward, it's moving backwards. And, you know, for me, writing those characters, it's the happy ever after is not just this magical bullet that sort of fixes everything. It's going to be a journey that those characters are going to go through forever. So, you know, for me, again, focusing on the happy ever after in that aspect is like doing justice to that as well. So, yeah.
Okay. So given that women were and still are in many countries historically very much second-class citizens with few rights and little to no autonomy over their lives, do you have any pointers for authors of historical romances who wish to write about independent and autonomous feminist heroines, but are worried that their character may seem too modern to fit in with, say, the Regency period, which is a very popular one, or 18th century China? And let's start with Jeannie.
Oh. Sorry, daughter. Yeah, so I think, you know, I primarily write in historical settings. I write in 18th century China and 8th century or 9th century China. But I think it's the author's responsibility to kind of convince the reader, right, that this is not a modern attitude, right? And I think the key to that is it's very easy to kind of put in a super strong character who has agency, right? It's very not necessarily easy, but you know, it's an easy trope. You have a warrior character, or you have a character who's super strong. You have a character who's rich and privileged, so they're above these other problems that women had, right? But you can't always do that, and so I think again, it's within her head. What agency can she find? And I think the key thing for me, at least in terms of finding this agency, is realizing that women have, and this is not a historical thing, this is in current time as well, women have always had to find their power in subtle ways, right? And a lot of that, I think, is connecting to other women. I think, you know, within my family, and this is even if you marry into the family, you find really quickly who are the women, who are the allies that you can count on, right? Who can help you open up a bank account, things like that. So I think that historicals have a very, they have a very kind of unique and kind of special opportunity to show what were these very subtle ways that women had to work within the patriarchy in order to find that autonomy and find that strength and do it realistically. And the reason why it'll ring true is because women still do it in modern times. Those same things. Have a bank account on your own, right, for financial independence. Have the women that you can go to, or men that you can go to, you know. I think that's how you have to do it. And you know, if it's a two-dimensional treatment of it, and I think just giving them that power, like I said, the automatic things, that it might be challenged, but I think when you can convince the reader with a three-dimensional character, then it'll ring true that it's not a modern feeling. It's something that women have always had to do. Okay,
Adriana?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm just kind of like starting to dip my toe into historical, but I mean, I write immigrants. That's like a central theme to the stories that I write. I write people who are in a new place, that have come, that are part of some kind of diaspora. For the immigrant, like, community is life. Like, you have to find the people that are like you in that place, because they're the ones that are going to help you navigate this like new place that you're in. And so that's like I've found that that's, like, as Jeannie said, it's like essential to me, kind of like forming these stories that are viable. I'm also writing Black women in a historical setting in Europe. So even though we were, there for since the 1500s, we're not there in fiction. We're not there in romance. And it's been really interesting to find these like little pockets of historical events. Like I'm writing a book, a series set in 1889 at the Paris World's Fair. And at that fair specifically, there were like 13 Latin countries that were represented in that fair, and they sent about 6,000 people from these 13 countries. It just so happens Dominican Republic, where I'm from, was one of the countries, and they sent about like 1,200 people. So like there's the historical, like we were there. And so like what I'm trying to do is build like a container that is Black and brown. And instead of having the one brown person in a historical setting where everyone's white, and I have like the one brown girl trying to like find the Duke, I'm building a container that's full of culture. Like I'm having Black and brown people that are not vessels to be filled by European culture, that come in fully filled of their own culture. So I think those are the things that I think make the characters more like three-dimensional, and also like make them like, I don't know, like it just gives them purpose. It gives them like impetus. It gives them I feel like I find it easier to believe that a person's going to be like able to achieve their HEA if they're not this like one little person trying to navigate these systems that are not built for them. And if you give them that community, if you give them like people to like help them thrive.
Mm-hmm. Bec?
Yeah, so I write historical set fantasy and that, so it's really interesting to sort of dive back through the books, and absolutely, as Jeannie and Adriana has said, like it was there. Like I think when you look at historical context, like the books that were available, the literature that was available was very whitewashed, very male dominated written. So it was sort of probably written out of those books that we sort of look at. But if you go in and actually research and that, like you've got Mary Wollstonecraft back in, 1790 writing, like coming out with the Vindication of the Rights of Women. You've got the suffragist movement that's, women that were starving themselves and marching sort of for the right to vote. So I think when you say like, those modern attitudes were always there, whether they were like, they're probably struggling against a system that was a lot more oppressive than we are today. And I'm not saying that our system now is completely unoppressive, and it's certainly not, it is very male dominated, very, white male dominated and that. So, but, it was definitely there. So again, like, a lot of my historical fantasy is set in an alternate Victorian era. And like, even you're looking at, sexuality within the Victorian era, it was very focused on, like women were sort of, it was all hidden in that, but underneath like the Victorian era, it was very sensual period. It was a very sexual period. And a lot of the things like, chastisement and BDSM, it was there in the Victorian period. So I think, you really do have to do your research in that and go beyond what was sort of published in that era and that as well. So
yeah. So let's talk about consent and coercion in the portrayal of relationships in romance. So romance has come a really long way from the Bodice Rippers. I'm going to put them in Bodice Rippers of the 1970s and 1980s. So many romance books, including your own books, are miles ahead of other genres with regards to the portrayal of courtship with consent and the development of relationships with mutual respect between the hero and heroine. However, the romanticizing of toxic relationships is something that is still present in some romance novels. These include astonishingly popular romance series such as Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, which appear to perpetuate the myth that stalking and abusive behavior is romantic. So do you think consent is an issue that the romance genre as a whole has successfully tackled in recent years? Adriana?
I mean, honestly, like, I think it's hard to make a blanket statement about romance because it is so big. Like, romance is such a big genre. There's so many people writing. There's so many subgenres. Like, indie is a huge market. And so I think, to me, like, it's hard to say that, like, as a whole, we've tackled everything we need to tackle. I think that's impossible. I think we'll always be evolving. But I do think that, like, the conversation around consent and romance is robust. It's very sophisticated. And I honestly think that within the literary fiction space, which, no matter what anyone says, we are in there. We are writing fiction that is, like, we are writing books. Like, and within genre fiction specifically, which we are a huge part of, romance is leaps and bounds ahead of the conversation, not only because we recognize where we started and, like, the changes we've had to make around, like, affirmative consent, enthusiastic consent, power dynamics, but also, like, intersections, and like we're talking about, like, intersectional feminism. We're trying to, like, understand that, like, that we are writing in a white supremacist. Like, these are all things that, like, many authors in romance are, like, actively working with. Like, it's something that, like, we bring to the page very intentionally. So I wouldn't say we've tackled everything as a whole. I don't think we'll ever get there because it's such a vast genre. But I do think by a lot in genre fiction, I think we probably are having, like, the most, like, robust conversations around consent. I really do think so.
Yeah. Bec?
I'm sorry, I missed a lot of that speech because I couldn't hear it. I don't know why my computer was cutting in and out, so I'm sorry if I'm recovering a lot of that. But absolutely, consent is an ongoing issue. I'd love to say that I think we're coming ahead in leaps and bounds, and that, but I think it's definitely going to be an ongoing sort of thing. I know myself, like, I did catch something about Adriana saying, like, a very affirmative sort of, like, you know, we're putting it into a voice, like, of our characters and that, rather than sort of being implied. And I know, like, with my first book, there was, like, a scene, I think, in that book that was probably not as affirmative as I could have made it. I would love to go back and be able to, you know, make it a lot more clearer in that sort of definition, and that. But, like, it's definitely, look, yeah, I think it's going to be an ongoing sort of situation, basically.
Yeah. Jeannie?
Yeah, I think the answer, I mean, it's hard to do a binary because I think society, right? As Adriana had pointed out, society has it set up in such a way where can a woman ever truly consent in her full power, right? And even more so in a historical setting. No, I don't want to say more so because there is no line of time, right? I think that, for instance, we've gone backwards on some things. But I think, you know, in the historical setting that I write in, can a woman ever really say yes? She can say yes, but really there's the pressure of the society around her. And for that reason, I think the conversation is very complex in romance, and there's space for that because of how many people are publishing, how many different facets of lives, you know, are being kind of presented there. And I think that's important that you see more than one view of things. I don't have enthusiastic consent, you know, or verbal consent even in my books. For that reason, I don't think these women can ever say yes in a way. I have to show in other ways, and I have to show that it's a complex question, right? Can a woman who's so much poorer than her suitor, even if she's like, yes, he's going to protect me, Sure, yes, right. But is she ever going to have that power? And there's no good answer to that question. And I think romance is there to explore that, right? To explore the power dynamics like that. And to kind of even explore, I think, some of the edges. Like I said, I write some of my stories have dubious consent, right? And I accept that there's a risk in doing that, and I accept that there's a responsibility to treat it, not just as some gratuitous plot device, but there's a reason it was done that way. And I think women exist in so many liminal spaces and so many gray areas where our decision making is gray, and I think it helps to be able to work these things out on the page where it's a safe space where they can be worked out. So are we there? No, but I don't think there is a there to reach in sort of this. I think the conversation is very, very robust, and I think that's what's important.
Yeah. And you know what you just said, you and Adriana talked about, not being able to say yes because of what we're surrounded with. And it sort of just going to put this on the table, which is, it reminds me of the whole emphasis on hypergamy in so many cultures and societies, where the only way that a woman can get out of poverty is to marry up. And at the risk of my mother coming in and knocking me on my head is, my own mother did the same thing, And for a lot of women, they still feel, or the culture that they're in still makes them feel like that is the only way out of poverty. So yes and no are nebulous things. And I think quite a few romances handle this really well, especially historical romances, because you get a heroine who's in very pressed circumstances. And I think Bec did that, portrayed it really well in her first book in the London Steampunk series. The heroine was under pressed circumstances and tried to, hold out for as long as she could before seeking patronage. So something that the audience might want to think about, that all of you have brought up, is that sometimes when we talk about consent, it's not always about enthusiastic consent. It's about taking everything else into consideration. So having said that, so we've got about another 20 minutes or so. So how can authors address or subvert toxic relationship tropes while crafting an emotionally satisfying romance? Adriana?
I think we're already, if you're going into the story, really trying to kind of get at the power dynamics and get at the difficulty and the gray areas in which women can find agency and can step into their power, you're already subverting the idea. If we go back to the 70s or whatever, where you have all these stories where, as Jeannie was saying, what's valued is purity and what's valued is this innocence and virginity, and you are placing value on something else, you're already subverting those conventions that the genre was kind of held founded on for a long time. And honestly, just being able, for me, just being able to write a story where I can put a Black woman in the 19th century, and by the end of it, she has her own business and a man that loves her and sees her as an equal. That's a pretty good place to be for where we were even 15 years ago when it came to the romance genre. So I think, and also what you said too, the importance too is what we're subverting is that white, cis white space that used to be romance, and that we are placing people with different experiences. And what Jeannie writes, what you were talking about, women who live in a different place that is not the United States of America or London, who have a different context, who have to make different choices, who are not living in individualistic societies who don't make decisions based on what they themselves want, but they have to think about a family that they need to support or a family that depends on them. And that, yes, comes with what's good for their community, for their family. And those complexities already are subverting like this idea of romance, which was cis, Christian, white, man and woman romance. Like, we are already subverting that just by placing these different stories that weren't there before and that are presenting a different way of living and being than what was like the norm.
Yeah. And Jeannie?
Yeah, I like what Adriana said about complexity is what subverts, I think, these toxic tropes. Because I think I'm of the mind that nothing, I don't want to say nothing, but let's just say nothing. Nothing should be taken off the table, right? I would like there to be waif heroines because there are women who are not able to speak up, right? I would like there to be physically weak heroines because there are women who are physically weak, right? And I don't like kind of saying like, well, if that is a trope that's harmful, take it off the table. Someone asked me once, oh, how do we get rid of the depictions of the submissive Asian female, right? Because that's a trope that's harmful. And my answer was, I don't think we should get rid of it. I think we need to explore it. If you're going to write a submissive, right, female, there's a reason. And I think the complexity is how you have to address it. That trope comes from somewhere. It speaks to something. And I think that removing it kind of is the opposite. That's not necessarily serving us by taking out, like, and I've talked about the warrior woman, right? Because I entered the field with a warrior woman. It's a very common trope, and it's something that people can easily say, look, strong woman, she's got a sword. But it only serves us so far, right? That stereotype, that trope only takes you so far. And if you kind of say, well, this is a better woman, a better example of womanhood than this woman, I think that that's toxic for us to do. So, long way to say complexity, I think, is how you fight it.
Yeah, and just to add to what you said, just to give a bit of context here, the Pixel Project's releasing an anthology in September, and one of the stories is written by Lee Murray, who is a New Zealand writer of Chinese descent, and she made an observation which is really pertinent and adds to what you say. She said that, now this is a book of revenge stories. I'm going to be straight. This is a book of revenge stories. Rapists, domestic abusers, violent men get their comeuppance. And Lee's story is one of the quietest in terms of revenge. No blood spilled, nothing. For the villain, but she also pointed out that because of the way a lot of East Asian societies and cultures are set up, it might not have occurred to the heroine within the context of a culture to actually have a really huge and loud point of revenge, way of taking revenge. So that I'm just putting this out there to add to what you just said. So, okay, so Bec, any thoughts?
I don't have a lot to add to that because that was incredible just listening to the two of you speak on those regards. For me, it's just, it's about creating women in all shapes and sizes, sort of. And I think, Jeannie, like when you were talking about the strong heroine, I think, that sort of resonated so strongly with me because I think all heroines are strong, like, in so many different ways. So they've all got like so much to overcome, like, whether they are the powerful warrior female or whether they are, existing in a society where, physically they are weaker, but they've got to, come to terms with like their power within that society and how they can sort of, push through it. So I'm not going to actually go too far into that because I think you guys were just so eloquent there.
Yeah. So Adriana mentioned earlier during the session, she talked a little bit about heroes in romances. So let's talk about male characters and tackling toxic masculinity. So in the past 10 to 15 years, the hero of many romance books have significantly evolved. Not all romance books, obviously, because like Adriana said, romance is huge. But right now, where maybe it's just me, but I'm seeing a far wider range of heroes than ever before. So do y'all think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability, it can be one of the ways that romance writers can break away from the tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women? Adriana.
I mean, look, like if you go to the Amazon charts, like men who have like serious problems with their like anger and like and aggressive men sell books. Like, and this is something that like is and it's something that, right, like it's something that we have to like I think I always say like there needs to be a lot of self-reflection about some of the stuff that I read sometimes and find like exciting, but like to me, like I can only go by what I write, and I write Black women always, and sometimes I write Black women who are in relationships with white men, and so again, like I have to write men who have self-awareness. And I think because if I don't write men who have self-awareness, then I'm going to set myself into a trap where I can't get that guy to be the hero my heroine deserves by the end of the book. But I think one of the things that we have to is like understand our own biases and understand the places where we have like our own stuff to work out, and like the behaviors that we might find appealing, but perhaps are like founded on something that might not be super healthy, and like kind of like explore that and get close to that and look at it and see if we can use that to like build a romance that is compelling, because these books sell for a reason, and I think we're all trying to get at something and trying to redeem this man who behaved terribly. And so what I think we have to get curious about why that is appealing to us and how we can use that to build stories where these men like have more dimensions to them, where they are more complex, where they have a better understanding of themselves, and where these heroines have clarity in what is like alluring them to them. And I think one thing that Jeannie said earlier, and I think is crucial, is having women who have a community around them. And I think when you have people that are surrounded by people that they're not isolated, that the only thing in their life isn't that man, just in that sense, you're diffusing like that tension of his toxicity being like dangerous, right? So I think that's also something to take into consideration. But I mean, it's something that I grapple with all the time, because an alpha hero is great to read.
Okay, Bec?
It's interesting that you say that, Adriana, because like I've often sort of thought to myself, like, you know, you look, as you say, these books sell really well, and like everyone loves the alpha hero, or not everyone, but you know, they're so popular. And it was really interesting. I think I was at a romance author mastermind session in December, and one of the talks was given by Theodora Taylor on universal fantasies, and like, you know, that uber protective like trait of that hero, like, you know, that obsessive kind of thing, like, you know, it's all about like the heroine being the absolute center of that, you know, and it's pushing that fantasy to the ultimate sort of edge of that. And that was a really eye-opening experience for me. Like, you know, are we drawn to the fantasy of like being the center of that hero's world, and to the point where, you know, those obsessive sort of probably problematic heroes, you know, they're pushing the boundaries on that. But I don't know that it's so much you know, those abusive sort of tendencies in a way that we're attracted to, so much as, you know, is it that fantasy of being the absolute center of that, you know, a hero that will do nothing, stop at nothing, you know, to do that. So, and I think like I have a lot more, you know, thought to give to that process, but it was just really eye-opening in that respect of why those, you know, why that sort of hero is particularly popular. And So I think sort of for me, reframing how, hostile and, toxic traits in men, it's really interesting. Like I pay a lot of attention to the men in my life and the way that they think about things. And I'll never forget, like when I was having my daughter, like my partner, he was, he came home from another friend who had given birth, and he was like, he cried. And like a couple of the guys sat there and said, he was like, oh, I won't be crying. And I was just like, that's such a toxic, like, where do you come from that? And I sort of, we often talk about things, and like when I said, why would you think that you wouldn't cry? And he was kind of like, he couldn't answer that for me. It's so inbuilt within society for him. And he was like, I don't know. I just, it was such a confronting moment for him. So I think, when you're putting it within your stories, like you're not just confronting it sort of for women, but also like I do have like a large male readership. So, 15% of my readership's around the male market, so, and they often like, they love that hero who can support their hero, and they love the less toxic tropes of that. So it's just, it's interesting on what you can put, like it's everywhere in society. I think everyone's sort of affected by it. So putting that into the books is sort of interesting for me. So yeah.
Jeannie?
Yeah, I think definitely the more, thank goodness for indie publishing and e-publishing, because I think even traditional e-publishing, because I think when there was only so many spots on the shelf, and it was like you can sell an alpha billionaire, or you can have this nuanced hero that maybe people might enjoy, but it's not going to fly off the shelves. The nuanced hero was just pushed aside, and the nuanced heroine was just pushed aside. I think in our current climate, there's space and readership and availability for a lot more variation. I think that's why we finally see, a lot more. And the conversation has gone towards, look, you could have a musician now. I remember there was a time when they were like, you know what, musicians, no, won't sell. You didn't have musicians as heroes. And if we wanted our book on the shelf, we tried to follow that, until you broke out and could do whatever you wanted. But now those rules aren't in place. So I think it's definitely helped just to show the depictions. I think representation does matter, and just seeing something different does matter. At the same time, I think alpha males are there for a reason, as everyone said. And you want to have that person who can protect you, but I think you also want to be the person who can finally, like, tame that rake or tame that billionaire, or that's also a fantasy, a power fantasy for women, right? Because we don't have the power, but we want to see that we can, and you can in romance, and I think that's important. So there might be much more of a kick from taming the Omega man than there would be in the guy who's already there and already sensitive to you. It's not that we love abuse, but we do love to feel that we could have that power too, and I would never want to take that away.
Yeah, it's as you and Adriana and Bec said, we're all marinating in the culture, and I wonder how many romance readers out there are kind like me, like maybe it's because of the work that I do, at stopping violence against women, that I sometimes crack open a romance book, and halfway through I just take it. Well, I use an e-reader now, so I can't really throw my tablet across the room, but I'm like, no, this is abusive. Run! I really wonder how many people actually have started thinking about it, especially in the Me Too era, when you realize that, oh, I shouldn't have let him do that to me, or not really, I shouldn't have let him do that, but that was wrong of him to do that to me. And you think of past relationships. So I wonder how far everyone has gone, down the road with that, now that we're in the middle of post Me Too. So come to the final two questions. So what can romance as a genre teach other genres about writing about violence against women, sexism, and misogyny in their stories? Adriana?
I think we're already doing a lot. I think, again, I think the romance is constantly grappling with how to depict violence against women? Does it have a place? If it does, how do you show it? How are you respectful? Like, there's so much that is and I think honestly, it's because this was a genre that was built by women, and I think like it's very present to us. It's always been a place where like women's issues have been like digested and like mulled over, and so I think it's always been a place where violence against women, misogyny, the patriarchy has always been kind of present and constantly being like looked at. So I think we're already a place where if you are wanting to know how to treat those topics, like romance is a good place to go. Like it's a good space to find people that are like doing it really well and doing it really intentionally.
Okay, Bec?
Well, for me, it's like romance is written mostly by women, sort of for women. So it's really centering sort of women's stories within that. And I think, you know, if you're looking at other genres, like how they can sort of look at, you know, what can they take from that? It's you know, it's all those questions are being asked, like, you know, as Adriana says, like, you know, the conversation's there, like, you know, it's written from a female point of view. So like they're things that you can look at from other genres and maybe think, you know, how can you incorporate that into your writing? How can you, you know, ask those questions of yourself and that. So yeah.
Yeah. Jeannie?
I think all books, you know, all books are a conversation of which, you know, the reader can hear one half of it and see the other half, and we only see one part of it. But I think romance, more than any other genre, we're aware of that conversation. Like, it's not just a metaphorical conversation. It really is a conversation because of how fast we publish, how many authors are publishing, how many readers are reading, that it's a lot of back and forth. That conversation is more realistic in romance than in other genres. So I think the fact that romance recognizes that conversation more so, and it shows up in the page, it shows up in what's being published, is something that I think other genres can learn, because you know, I've heard, for instance, oh, it's my art, this is what I'm going to do. They sort of, other genres can remove themselves from the readers, and I think in romance we already admit, no, you can't. It's part of that conversation, and so I think that's what other genres can learn from us.
Yeah. So we've come to a final question, and just a note to the audience: we have probably time for one more question from the audience, but here's our final question anyway. So let's start with Jeannie. What romance books would you recommend to aspiring romance writers as well as new romance readers to read, to see good examples of how violence against women and girls is handled well?
I'm glad I get to go first, because then no one else is going to steal these, and then I'll be stuck. Courtney Milan had a novella, The Governess Affair, and I think that was a great depiction of kind of complex trauma, right? It's historical, and deals with a rape, but it kind of goes through the complex trauma of it, you know, and it's not sort of the big T where she's big T traumatized, but there's definitely her dealing with the trauma there. And I think it's a very good nuanced approach. And then Kennedy Ryan, and this could be a very tough read. She won it was a Rita Award-winning book, Long Shot. Amazing, tough read, like it just guts you. So I think that's an example of sort of the other sort of the spectrum, where on the page there is some graphic depiction. Like, that's my trigger warning for readers. However, she handles it so well, and if it wasn't that graphic, I don't think you would get that level of empathy, just understanding that women are really put into a really hard situation, and you can't, it's not a matter of strength, it's not a matter of, you know, education, it's not that she wasn't strong enough, that she didn't make the right moves, you know, it's something that women are put into, and I think she really got to the core of that. But it is it's an emotional read, you know, emotional roller coaster, but I think it's worth the ride.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, if anyone is interested in hearing what Kennedy Ryan has to say, we actually hosted Kennedy Ryan last year. She talked a lot about long shots, so you can go to our YouTube main YouTube page, search for Kennedy's session and talk about it and see what she has to say about it. Okay, Adriana?
Well, every rule has its exception because mine is also long shot, and I can't read violence, graphic violence in stories. But like Jeannie said in the beginning, it would take a skilled writer, and Kennedy Ryan is a masterful author, and she's a friend of mine, and we've talked about this book a lot, and she really goes to the heart of what living in a violent, severely violent relationship can be like the level of like the chaos of it, and how and what survivors, like the resilience of survivors, and the strength it requires to just like day to day like be able to like maneuver that level of violence. And so that, I think like that's like the one book I probably would recommend, because it really, she just did like a masterful job.
Okay, Bec?
I think I laughed when you said that, because I was just, long shot was sort of on my list as well. Like I'm nearly 3/4 of the way through, and it's just been, and I think it had been recommended on a podcast sort of a month ago, and it was just blowing my mind, sort of basically like, you know, yeah, just really gripping and getting to. I think for me, Lisa Kleypas, like I love some of her historical romances, sort of writing sort of, you know, heroines and heroes sort of against that are not like the typical society sort of darlings, basically, and some of the things that she does with that. And I think I've lost it. I had it here before. I'm sorry. I'm having I had a little list here, and I was actually going through it, and I can't find it again. So sorry.
All right, so do you have it? Do you find it? Okay. So I just want to check with y'all. There's one more question from the audience. Are y'all okay to take that question from the audience? One more question? Okay. So Misty has one more question. Do you believe men can write believable and reasonable romance stories, whether or not there is violence against female characters in them? And let's start with Jeannie.
Yes, absolutely. I think just like we do, it's a part of get into that conversation, be a part of the conversation. You know, even though I am a woman, I could write a character just like me, and I will take the feedback when someone reads it and says that's unrealistic. So yeah, I think men can definitely be a part of that, but just like we do, get into the conversation and be willing to accept feedback.
Okay, Bec?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, there's probably females writing romance with violence in it that, you know, can be a little like you just as, you know, liable to be blindsided as some men. But I think you do have to do your research, and you know, you have to be aware of sort of what exists out there in terms of sort of, you know, really think it through, get your beta readers, get your background on that. So yeah.
Okay, and Adriana with the last word for this.
Sure. Like I'm not a man. I write romances with a man and a woman, and I can do it. So I think it's all about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to say, and like your self-awareness of like the landscape that you're writing in. But I think if you do your homework, if you know, try to do like honor what you're doing, it's sure.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap up. So just to let everyone know that we have our fundraiser up and it's moving a tad slowly because we're now in the middle of March and we've only just raised $760 towards our $5,000 goal. But we have a ton of goodies up from different authors, including Adriana, Jeannie, and Bec. So one thing I would like to emphasize here is that Adriana, Jeannie, and Bec have each offered to do a written critique of your story. So if you're a romance author, they have one each up there on a fundraising page, which Anusha is going to put in the chat box soon, and I'll put a slide up soon. And if you are thinking of having some further coaching, well, not coaching per se, but you would like to get some feedback from either Adriana, Jeannie, or Bec, and some tips on writing your romance, then go to our fundraising page, and I'm going to share the screen now. Go to our fundraising page at R4P Rally Up IWD 2021, and that's all case sensitive. And you can go there, and there's only one of each writing critique session. And Adriana's session also has a follow-up 30-minute Skype call for you to discuss what she's critiqued about your session. Jeannie and Bec are both happy to answer a few questions as a follow-up as well. And Adriana has also has a signed and personalized bundle of all her books, including the Dreamer series. And she also has included He's Come Undone, which is a romance anthology that is currently out of print, according to Amazon anyway. So if you want to try out several different romance authors, including Adriana, this would be the bundle to get. And Bec has a special treat out for her fans and fans of paranormal romance. She's offering for 1 week only, from between 11th and 18th March, the opportunity for donors to donate just $10 to us. And you can download the first 3 chapters of an eagerly awaited Curse of Darkness novel. And there are plenty more author goodies available this week from authors and publishers, including Reese Bowen, if you like historical mysteries, Bridget Kammerer, if you like YA fantasy, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, if you like feminist fantasy, Anna Stevens, if you like feminist grimdark fantasy, Jodie Meadows, if you like YA fantasy, Julie Trineda, if you're a science fiction fan, and Zank Books, if you are looking for literary feminist fiction to read. And more treats are released every Thursday throughout March 2021. Please give generously to help us keep the lights on, including programs like Read for Pixels. Now, if you want to find out more about Read for Pixels, you can go to bit.ly/Read for Pixels, and you can find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it by visiting us at www.thepixelproject.net. Now I'm going to put everyone back on screen. Does anyone have, Jeannie, Adriana, Bec, do you all have any announcements to make before we go? Anything coming up? New books? No? All right. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world. I know some of you have all of you are sort of scattered across several continents. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're a huge romance fan, don't forget we have Julia Quinn in the house with us next Sunday on the 21st. She'll be with us from 6 p.m. Pacific time onwards, chatting about her books with us and the female characters in the books and so on and so forth. Have a great Sunday, everybody.